All right, so let's dive into something I think a lot of people struggle with. Um, Reading in a new language. We're going to take a look at some research and expert opinions. To help you become a more confident reader, it's really like a journey. From facing those like initial fears and hurdles to figuring out how those people who just seem to get it do it.
And it's a journey anyone can take. We'll be using two main sources today. We're going to be looking at excerpts from Materials for Developing Reading Skills by Hitomi Masahara,
Okay.
and also a really helpful FAQ section from Second Language Reading, Challenges and Solutions.
And hopefully by the end of this deep dive, not only will you feel ready to tackle reading in your new language, but you'll also find yourself maybe even enjoying it.
Because reading in another language shouldn't feel like a chore,
Hmm.
but rather like an exciting new exploration.
Yeah, exactly. Let's face it, we've all been there, staring at a page full of unfamiliar words and symbols, feeling completely lost. But the thing is, you're not alone.
You're not.
Our sources point out that these challenges are like surprisingly universal for second language learners, or as they're often called, L2 readers.
It's almost reassuring, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
To know that, regardless of your background or the language you're learning, others have faced these same challenges.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. So let's break down some of these challenges that people face. One that I always struggle with is that initial lack of confidence. It's so easy to get caught comparing yourself to native speakers, and then you end up feeling like you're not progressing fast enough.
Yeah, that lack of confidence can quickly turn into anxiety, especially when you encounter unfamiliar words and grammar. It's that feeling of just being completely overwhelmed by this sea of unknown vocabulary.
Right. And then because of that, it can become even harder to understand what you're reading as a whole.
Mhm.
You might start to doubt your ability to understand even the simplest sentences, and then it just creates this vicious cycle.
Yeah. And speaking of those cycles,
Mhm.
another common challenge is that belief that we have to understand every single word. It's almost as if we've been trained to reach for the dictionary at every turn.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been there. I remember when I first started learning Italian, I would literally get stuck on every single word I didn't know. I'd be flipping through my dictionary for ages. By the time I finished a paragraph, I had no idea what I just read.
Right.
It was exhausting.
Yeah, and it takes all the joy out of reading.
Exactly. So, this brings us to something called foreign language reading anxiety, or FLRA. It's basically a specific type of anxiety tied to reading in a foreign language.
Yeah, it's interesting because FLRA, it isn't the same as just general language anxiety. It's specifically triggered by, the visual and cognitive demands of processing text in a new language. It's like when you're deciphering unfamiliar writing systems, or you're struggling to decode meaning at a comfortable pace. Yeah, it's a lot to handle.
So it's not just being nervous to speak the language, it's feeling anxious while you're reading it.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But isn't some anxiety normal when you're learning anything new? How do we know when it's becoming a problem?
That's a great question. It's all about recognizing when that anxiety starts to hold you back. And our sources highlight that the intensity of FLRA, it can actually be influenced by a bunch of different things, like the writing system of the language you're learning, your stage of learning, even the type of instruction you've received.
So someone learning Japanese, with its complex writing system, might experience a different level of FLRA compared to someone learning Spanish.
Exactly. The complexity of the writing system, the differences in the grammatical structures, it can all contribute. And, research has shown there's a clear link between high levels of FLRA and lower reading proficiency.
So the more anxious we feel while we're reading, the less likely we are to actually understand.
It can definitely feel that way. But understanding FLRA is the first step in learning how to manage it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Now, I'm curious, have you ever felt these feelings while you're reading in your new language? Like that feeling of your heart racing, your mind going blank when you see a page of foreign text.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone has.
Yeah,
All right, so we've all been there.
right.
But now let's talk about those people who seem to just breeze through foreign texts. You know what sets them apart?
Yeah, what is their secret? It almost seems like a superpower sometimes.
Right.
Well, our sources offer some really interesting insights into the habits of those successful L2 readers. And it might not be as magical as it seems. One key difference is their ability to process language automatically
Yeah.
and very quickly.
So they're just absorbing the meaning. while we're busy sounding out each word and mentally translating everything.
Exactly. Think about how you read in your native language. You don't really stop to think about every grammatical structure. You just get the meaning.
Yeah.
Successful L2 readers, they've managed to develop this same automaticity, but in their new language.
So it's almost like they've bypassed that whole translation step.
Right.
Their brains have created a shortcut.
Right. And this leads us to the second characteristic, something called automatic syntactic parsing.
Okay, syntactic parsing. That sounds a bit technical. Can we break that down a little?
Sure. It just means that they can understand the structure of sentences without even thinking about it. You know how words fit together to create meaning? Think of it like those mental maps that people create when they're learning their way around a new city. They can quickly navigate the sentences, recognizing the landmarks, and understanding how they relate to one another.
So instead of getting lost in a maze of grammar rules, they have a clear sense of direction.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third characteristic, effective semantic proposition formation. What that basically means is they're really good at extracting meaning from sentences, quickly and easily. They can pinpoint the main ideas, the relationships between those ideas, and the overall message. It's almost as if they have a built-in decoder ring, for text.
So they're not just reading the words, but they're understanding the meaning behind them. Like a detective piecing together clues to solve a mystery.
That's a great analogy. They see the individual words,
Yeah.
but they're also focused on the bigger picture, the overall story those words are telling.
Okay, that makes sense. So you might be wondering, how do we develop these skills, these automatic processing skills?
Yeah,
And that leads us to, I guess, the heart of reading, comprehension.
exactly.
And I'm guessing it's a lot more complex than just knowing vocabulary and grammar rules. Our sources mention a bunch of different factors that play a role.
It is. It's definitely more complex. It's a multifaceted puzzle. And our sources outline 4 key factors that influence L2 reading comprehension. The first one is linguistic processing. This is the foundation. It's the ability to decode sounds and symbols, understand vocabulary, and work with those grammatical structures.
So all the language-specific elements that we've been talking about.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just the purely linguistic elements. The second factor is pragmatic and sociocultural processing. And this means understanding those unspoken rules of communication, the cultural context, and how those things shape the meaning of a text.
Can you give us like a specific example of that?
Yeah, sure. So let's say you're reading a story. That's set in a culture where indirect communication is the norm. If you're not aware of that cultural nuance, you might misinterpret what the characters are really saying or doing. The same words can carry very different meanings, depending on the cultural context.
That's a good point. You know, it reminds me of when you're watching a foreign film and you suddenly realize that's a simple gesture can have a totally different meaning in another culture.
Yeah.
And it completely changes how you understand what's going on.
Exactly. And that's why being aware of these sociocultural differences
Yeah.
is so important for comprehension. You're not just decoding words. You're actually decoding the world behind those words.
It makes you realize how much our own culture influences how we understand things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The third factor builds on that idea. It's called real life and world contextual knowledge. And this refers to your general understanding of the world, your experiences, your knowledge base, even your memories. All of these things come together to help you make sense of new information.
So basically, the more we know about the world, the better equipped we are to understand a text.
Exactly. It's like having a bigger mental toolbox to draw from.
Okay.
So let's say you're reading an article about some kind of historical event in another country. If you already have some background knowledge of that country's history and culture, you'll be able to connect with that article on a much deeper level. You'll be able to fill in the gaps and make inferences that somebody without that knowledge just wouldn't be able to.
Right. It's like having a map of the territory you're exploring. The more landmarks you can recognize, the easier it is to find your way around.
Exactly. And finally, we have the fourth factor, which might surprise some people. It's emotional and attitudinal reactions.
You mean like our feelings and opinions about something can actually influence how well we understand it? I wouldn't have thought that would play a role.
It might seem a little bit counterintuitive,
Right.
but it's true. Our emotions and our attitudes towards the text, they can actually shape how we interpret it, whether we realize it or not. If we're interested in the topic, we're naturally more likely to engage with it and really try to understand it.
So if I'm reading some kind of technical manual about something that I find super boring, my comprehension is probably going to be worse.
It's possible.
Okay.
And the opposite is true, too.
Yeah.
If you're reading a novel about something you're really passionate about, you might find yourself completely absorbed. Even if the language is difficult, your enthusiasm actually helps you to understand.
Right. So it's not just a cold cognitive process.
Right.
There's an emotional element to it as well.
Absolutely, we bring our whole selves to the act of reading. And that includes our emotions.
So we've got these four main factors: linguistic, sociocultural, real-world knowledge, and even our own emotions, all contributing to comprehension. It makes you wonder if those traditional ways of teaching reading are really addressing this complexity.
It's a really good point. And it's something that our sources explore in detail. They talk about three main approaches that have been used in language teaching, and each one has its own strengths and weaknesses.
You've probably encountered some of these, things like pre-teaching vocabulary, endless comprehension questions. Do these things really work?
Well, let's start with what's called comprehension-based approaches, which often involves bombarding students with, tons of comprehension questions after they read something. It's a pretty common approach.
Yeah,
But it doesn't always result in a deeper understanding.
I can see that. Just answering questions, it doesn't really seem like the most effective way to engage with the text.
Exactly. While it can be useful for assessing basic understanding, it doesn't really encourage critical thinking or help students to explore all those nuances of the text.
Right. It's kind of like trying to understand a piece of music. Just
Yeah.
by identifying the instruments, you miss the harmony. You know the emotion, the overall impact.
That's a great analogy. It's about going beyond the surface
Yeah.
and really digging into those deeper layers of meaning. Now, another common approach is the language-based approach, which often focuses on pre-teaching vocabulary lists before students even start reading.
Oh, yeah. The dreaded vocabulary list. I remember spending hours trying to memorize those lists of words and then forgetting them as soon as I saw them in an actual text.
It's a very common experience,
Yeah.
and research suggests that it might not be the best way to go about it. While a strong vocabulary is obviously super important, learning long lists of words in isolation, it can feel very disconnected from the actual act of reading.
Right. It's like trying to understand a city. Just by memorizing a list of street names, you need a sense of the layout. You know the landmarks, the context.
Exactly. And not only can it be ineffective, it can actually disrupt the flow of reading. Imagine, constantly pausing to look up words that you've memorized, but you can't really remember in context. It's like watching a film with constant interruptions.
It takes you out of the experience, and it makes reading feel like a chore.
Exactly. And then finally, we have what's called skill strategy-based approaches.
Okay.
These approaches try to equip students with specific skills, like skimming and scanning and making inferences.
Those seem a little bit more practical, like giving them the tools to actually navigate the text.
They are valuable skills, but if you focus solely on isolated skills like that, it can create a very fragmented reading experience.
Okay.
It's kind of like learning to play a musical instrument, but only practicing individual notes in isolation. You're missing the rhythm, the melody, the overall beauty of the music.
So reading is more than just a set of skills.
Exactly.
It's about bringing them all together to create a more holistic experience.
It is. It's about engaging with the text as a whole, connecting the language, the cultural nuances, even the emotional undercurrents, to create a really meaningful experience.
So if these traditional approaches aren't quite hitting the mark, what's the alternative? Is there a better way to teach L2 reading? One that really embraces this holistic view?
Well, thankfully there is. And it's all about shifting the focus from rote learning to genuine engagement, from dissecting texts to actually experiencing them.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. Tell me more about that.
So it's all about creating a reading experience that truly resonates with the learner, one that sparks their curiosity, ignites their imagination, and taps into their emotions.
So instead of forcing someone to trudge through a text, we're inviting them to explore a whole new world.
Exactly. It's about nurturing a love of reading, a desire to discover new ideas and perspectives through the written word.
That sounds great. But how do we actually create that kind of experience? What are the key elements?
But this alternative approach is built on 4 core principles. The first one is called engaging affect.
Okay, engaging affect. That sounds a little bit technical. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Of course. It really comes down to this. We're wired to pay attention to things that make us feel something, things that evoke emotions, whether it's joy or sadness, curiosity, maybe even a little bit of fear.
So we should be choosing texts that actually interest the reader and make them feel invested.
Exactly. It's about finding texts that align with their interests, their experiences, their values, text that makes them want to keep reading, not because they have to, but because they just can't put it down.
I can see how that would make a huge difference, finding those books that really resonate. Okay, so what's the next principle?
The next principle is what we call pre-listening.
So like listening to an audiobook or a recording of the text before you actually read the physical book.
Exactly. It might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but hearing the text read aloud can actually be incredibly helpful for language learners.
I can see how it would help with like pronunciation and stuff, but does it actually improve comprehension?
It does. Absolutely. Think about it this way. When you're trying to understand a text in a new language, you're basically juggling a whole bunch of tasks all at once. You're trying to decipher unfamiliar scripts, recognize words, parse grammar, and extract meaning. It's a lot to process.
It sounds overwhelming, like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a unicycle.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But pre-listening, it takes away one of those juggling balls.
Okay.
It lets the learner hear the natural rhythm and intonation of the language. They can just absorb the sounds and the meaning without that extra cognitive load of visually decoding the text.
So it's like giving their brain a head start, a chance to process the language in a more natural way. And does that pre-listening approach also have any impact on their pronunciation?
That's a great question, and research suggests it does. By hearing the language spoken naturally, learners can start to internalize those correct pronunciation patterns, which can actually improve their own speaking.
So it's like providing a model for them to imitate, a way to really soak up the nuances of the spoken language. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. So we've got engaging effect, pre-listening. What's the third principle?
The third principle is what we call multidimensional mental representation.
Okay. I gotta admit, multidimensional mental representation, that sounds pretty complex.
It might sound intimidating, but it's a really fascinating concept. It's essentially about encouraging learners to move beyond just seeing words on a page and to create a much richer, more immersive experience in their minds.
So instead of just passively reading the words, they're actively engaging with the text, creating images, imagining the scenes, connecting with the emotions.
Exactly. It's about tapping into their imagination, engaging all of their senses, and linking the text to their own personal experiences and memories.
I can definitely see how that would make reading more engaging and memorable. But is that something you can actually teach? How do we help learners to develop this multidimensional mental representation?
It's definitely a skill that can be developed through well-designed activities. One really powerful technique is using visual aids. Imagine you're reading a story about a character who's traveling through a really busy marketplace. Instead of just relying on the words on the page, you could show them images or videos of an actual marketplace. Let them see all those vibrant colors, hear the sounds, maybe even imagine smelling the spices.
So it's about providing those sensory anchors, those hooks that help them to connect the words to something real.
Exactly. And another really effective technique is to encourage them to create their own visual representations of the text. This could be anything from, drawing pictures to building models to even acting out scenes. The key is to get them actively involved in bringing the story to life in their own unique way.
So it's about tapping into their creativity, letting them express their understanding in different ways. It definitely sounds like a much more engaging way to learn.
It is. And our source material actually gives us some great examples of how this works in practice. For instance, there was one study where researchers asked participants to read descriptions of a Japanese fruit called a sho. The first description was purely linguistic, like it just outlined the fruit's physical characteristics, like you'd find in a dictionary definition.
So they were given a factual description, but without any real-world context.
Exactly. And because most of the participants had never actually seen this fruit before, they couldn't form a picture of it in their minds. The words were just abstract concepts.
Like trying to imagine a color you've never seen before, it's hard to grasp.
Exactly. But then the researchers gave them a second description of the same fruit, this time using vivid imagery and sensory details. They talked about its round shape, its smooth skin, the firm white flesh. And suddenly the participants could connect the description to something that they were familiar with.
So even though they'd never seen a show, they could imagine something like an apple.
Exactly. That's the power of multidimensional mental representation.
Right.
It goes beyond literal definitions
Okay. Yeah.
to help form a richer and more meaningful understanding.
It's like opening up a whole new dimension of the text, bringing it to life in your mind.
And that brings us to the fourth and final principle of this approach, experiencing the text before you analyze it.
So instead of immediately jumping into the grammar rules and vocabulary definitions,
Right.
we're letting the reader connect with the story on a more personal level first.
Exactly. It's about giving them the space to explore the text,
Hmm.
to come up with their own interpretations,
Yeah.
and connect with it emotionally before we start breaking it down analytically.
Like letting them savor the flavors of a meal before we start explaining the chemical composition of every ingredient.
Exactly. It's about fostering a love for that experience of reading before we get into all the technical aspects.
Okay, I love that. So how do we actually put this principle into practice? Are there specific techniques that we can use to encourage this experience first approach?
Yeah, there are. There are. One really good one is using what we call prediction activities. So before the learners even start reading, you can give them a few key words or phrases and have them try to guess what the story is going to be about.
Oh, that's interesting. So like you're getting them thinking about the text before they even start reading it, kind of like setting the stage.
Exactly. And another technique that's really helpful is using think aloud protocols. So this is where you basically have the learner talk about their thoughts and feelings while they're reading, so you can actually get a glimpse into their comprehension process.
Because like you can see what's going on in their heads and how they're making connections and understanding the text.
Exactly. And it not only helps you to understand how they're reading, but it also encourages metacognition, which is the ability to think about our own thinking.
Oh, wow. So by actually talking about their thoughts, they become more aware of their own learning process. And that can help them to develop better reading strategies.
Exactly. It's like turning on a light in a dark room.
Yeah.
Suddenly they can see things more clearly.
It seems like this approach really changes things up compared to the traditional reading methods. It's about making reading more engaging and enjoyable, and actually creating a meaningful experience by tapping into our emotions, our imagination, and our personal connections.
It really is a paradigm shift. It's about letting go of those rigid structures and embracing a more holistic and learner-centered view.
Speaking of embracing a holistic view, our sources mentioned this study where participants read a poem called Refugee, Mother and Child. It's by Chinua Achebe, and they experience that multidimensional mental representation that we were just talking about.
And that's a really powerful poem. And it definitely seems to have triggered that deeper level of engagement in those participants.
So we encourage you, our listeners, to go and check out that poem. Experience it for yourself. Pay attention to how the words make you feel, what kind of images they create in your mind, and what connections you make.
And remember, as you continue learning to read in your new language, it's not about memorizing grammar rules and vocabulary lists. It's about nurturing that love of reading, embracing that process of discovery, and allowing yourself to really get lost in the world that the text creates.
It's about making reading an adventure,
Yeah.
an exploration, a journey. And with the right approach, anyone can become a confident and fluent reader in their new language.
Absolutely. So until next time.
Happy reading.
Yeah, there are some good techniques. One that I like to use is prediction activities. Before the learners even start reading, you give them a few keywords or maybe some phrases, and then you can ask them to try and predict what they think the story might be about.
Oh, that's cool. So it's like you're setting the stage and getting them curious before they even open the book.
Exactly. Another one is using think aloud protocols. Basically, you just have the learner talk about their thoughts,
Yeah.
as they're reading, so you can get a little peek into their thought processes and how they're comprehending.
So it's almost like you're getting to see how they're understanding and making connections in real time.
Yeah, and it not only helps you as a teacher or whoever's working with the learner to see how they're reading, but it also encourages something called metacognition. Metacognition, which is basically the ability to, think about our own thinking.
Oh, wow. So by verbalizing their thoughts, they become more aware of how they're learning, which could lead to like better reading strategies down the line.
Exactly. It's kind of like switching on a light, in a dark room.
Makes sense. It seems like this approach really changes the game from traditional reading methods. Like you're trying to create an engaging and enjoyable experience and really make it meaningful for the learner by tapping into all that stuff we've been talking about. The emotions and imagination and personal connections.
Yeah, it really is a huge shift, moving away from the rigid structures of traditional methods to something more holistic and really centered around the learner.
And speaking of holistic, our sources mentioned this really interesting study where people read a poem. It was Refugee, Mother and Child by Chinua Achebe. And they experienced that multidimensional mental representation that we were talking about.
Yeah, I've read that poem. it's very powerful and moving. It makes sense that it would trigger that kind of deeper engagement.
Yeah, for sure. So we encourage you, dear listener, to go and find that poem and read it yourself. Really pay attention to how those words make you feel, what kind of images pop into your head, and what connections you're making.
And as you continue on your journey of learning to read in another language, remember that it's not about memorizing a bunch of grammar rules and vocab. It's about really enjoying reading, embracing the journey, and letting yourself get lost in the world that the words create.
It's about making reading an adventure and exploration. And with the right approach, anyone can become a confident reader in their new language.
Absolutely. So until next time, happy reading, everybody.